I just read something recently. This is the third consecutive year where the majority of U.S. adults have no trust in the media.
So I think one of the things that's happened, and I'm curious your thoughts on this as someone who's on TV a lot and obviously on podcasts, and it used to be everyone watched the same newscast. And so we kind of all just agreed on what the same topics were. Now, the same important things to talk about. Now, that might have not have been as inclusive as it should have been. And it might have been talking about these issues and not that issues, but we all had a common prayer book that we were sort of reading from. Now, everything is so balkanized, right? You and I probably, our media diet probably overlaps by most 15%. And that's actually really, really high.
Wow.
Yeah. And if we were to do this whole room, I'll bet you that there's a podcast that one person in this room listens to and no one else listens to, and we can multiply that by 10. Everything is kind of balkanized now. So as a result, we're getting all these little different pieces of input, pieces of news. And so when I sit down with you and I want to talk about politics, in my head, I've got 5 things that I'm thinking about, that I've heard about, that seem like the most important things on earth. And you've got 5 different things that you've heard about that seem like the most important thing on earth. And you're saying, how to come he doesn't take seriously this thing that's so clearly important? That's where this breakdown happens. But so what cuts through that? What cuts through that is our lived experiences. Because it does not matter what newspaper you read or what podcast you listen to, we both have kids. We know what it's like to raise teenagers.
That's right.
They might watch completely different TikTok channels, they might watch, but they all sometimes act like 13-year-olds.
Well, you're very diplomatic with that.
In both the best and the worst ways possible.
Yeah.
So that's something, if we set all that stuff aside and we say, what's it like? Tell me what it's like to be raising kids. Let me tell you what it's like for me. Suddenly now we are reading from that same prayer book. We have the same experiences we can talk about. And that's how we get from there to saying like, oh, now that I know a little bit about you, like, who'd you vote for last time? Tell me a little bit about that.
That's great. That's really good. Because here's the deal. We see what we want to see.
Yeah.
We hear what we want to hear. And there's just so much built-in bias. It's fascinating to me how we all just kind of like forget how much our own fears, our own shared experiences growing up, in the tribe we run with, right?
Yeah.
We all kind of have some commonality there. So these people over here are crazy. They're nuts.
Right.
They hate people like me. And you just start spinning into this narrative that's almost impossible to overcome, except for what you just said. And I think that's huge. Because you could be sitting next to a raging conservative or a liberal at a soccer game. And if you never get into that, you walk away going, what a fantastic guy. I'm telling my wife, this guy, super interesting. But if I found out something about how he did this, or he votes and thinks this, I may not give him the time of day.
That's absolutely right. And I was just talking to a researcher at NYU, Jay Van Bavel, who's done a lot of work on this. And one of the things he's found is that when we assign someone a label without knowing them, we assume that they maximize that label. So if I know that you're a Democrat, I assume you are all for, trans rights and gay marriage and X and Y and Z. And if you hear I'm a Republican, you're going to assume that I'm pro-gun and I'm pro-Trump and I pro-military. And the truth of the matter is, in actuality, yeah, you're a Democrat, but you're like 10% a Democrat, right? And I'm 10% a Republican. And so if we live side by side and we put those different signs on our lawn, then the truth of the matter is, the thing that we have in common, like I spend 2% of my time thinking about politics and 10% of my time thinking about the pothole that's in front of my house.
Right.
And my neighbor's thinking about that pothole too, right?
Yes, there's a shared value.
Exactly. So why are we letting this 2% dominate how we see each other when there's 98% where we have a lot in common?
Yeah.
And that's the key is, even if we know someone is a label, even if we hear this person is an X or a Y or a Z, or they self-identify that way, or we just look at them and we say, oh, that person is different from me, that does not mean that we've done a good job of estimating who they are. And the only way to estimate who they are is to go up and ask them about their experiences.
Yeah. Before I move on from this topic, I am curious if you could wave a wand and fix big-time media's trust issue. When people don't trust them. I mean, you're inside. I am just curious because I think you know, how would they begin to communicate differently? Because they've got a communication and a connection problem. They
Yeah.
seem to just connect to our fears.
So I think that we used to live in a world, I'll talk mostly about print because that's my background. We used to live in a world where most people had local newspapers, right? Take the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or Fox News or CNN. They're talking to literally the entire world. And so it's pretty hard to signal to folks, I'm listening to you, unless they're spot on your demographic. But the Tennessean, the Akron paper, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, they're talking to a much smaller group, and they can say, maybe our politics are left or right, but like, here's the things we're thinking about. It's the same things you're thinking about because we live next to each other. I don't know how big media turns this around without getting closer to different groups. And we see that happening right now. Axios it has a bunch of Axios locals are trying to talk to specific communities and cities. But the closer we get to the local, the more that these kind of big political issues fade away.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think that's why we've seen the rise of podcasters.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, podcasting has risen in its credibility because you feel like they're talking about stuff that I actually care about.
I hadn't even thought about that till you just said this, but I actually think podcasts might be the new local newspaper. And it's not necessarily a local newspaper geographically. Could be, I really like Pokemon cards and there's 60 other people in the world who do, and so we're going to listen to the Pokemon podcast. But you're right. We're getting closer to that local experience.
How did you respond when you see the Trump White House, has now said, we're going to give press passes to major podcasters?
I think
that
great.
has leveled the playing field.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think the more that we do anything to expand the conversation, to get closer to the people who are having that conversation, the better off we are.
Do you think we could have conversations about race or politics or religion 50 years ago and it's gotten worse? Or are we just now so much more connected via devices and everybody can throw their opinion out? You understand the question?
Yeah.
Has it gotten worse or has it always been that way and we just are now exposed to the fact that none of us know how to communicate on something that's kind of controversial?
So I think there was a time when it was better in this country. I think
that would be my feeling.
Yeah, and all the research shows us we've become more polarized. A way I like to put it is we've kind of fallen out of practice of having these hard conversations, right? So 50 years ago, your and my grandfathers, they belonged to the Elks Club or to the Rotary Club, and they probably had a church that they went to on Sundays and then a prayer group on Wednesdays. They had a whole community, and in that community, they were practicing conversation all the time. They were very, very good at it. So that doesn't necessarily mean you and I agree with each other, but this gets to what the goal of a conversation is. The goal of a conversation is not for us to agree with each other. The goal of a conversation is not to convince you you're right or you're wrong and I'm right or I'm smart or you should like me. The goal of a conversation is just to understand how you see the world and to speak in such a way that you understand how I see the world. And if we walk away from a conversation disagreeing with each other, but we got that understanding, the conversation has been a success.
It's hard to hate somebody you understand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you know that they want to understand you, you want to understand them in return.
Yeah.
So I think what happened in the past is that we just had more practice signaling that we wanted to understand. And we've fallen out of practice. We've fallen out of practice because of technology. We've fallen out of practice because it's a lot easier to not talk to people who disagree with us now. Or if we do talk to people who disagree with us, to be screaming at each other. But for each of us as leaders in our families and in our communities and in our businesses, we can take that responsibility on to not only practice doing this, but to model it for other people.
Yeah.
Because that's going to give them a confidence practice.
All right, let's go to a question right back here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one, thank you for that conversation about just how we can connect over politics. I think it's one of the most important things we can be cultivating right now. For myself, this idea of when I get furious, get curious, like I'm definitely taking that away. And I'm like, I think this is really good interpersonally for me. I'm interested to hear what you think about our political leaders in the sense that misunderstanding seems to be a benefit, not a, a benefit of the system, not a flaw. It's like we have to be misunderstood because then we can cultivate our group of people. How do you see this playing into like are actual political leaders. Can you help with? Can you help them? Like,
So it's interesting. I have a couple of friends who are serving in Congress. One who's a senator and a couple who are Congress people, and they say that the biggest difference now when they come in, it used to be, again, 50 years ago, even like 20 years ago, you came in and like you'd get on TV and you'd say like, those guys are the worst, they're awful. And then once the camera stopped, you'd go have dinner with those guys,
Tip,
right?
Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan
Exactly.
were famous for that.
Exactly. And what's happened now is that that has stopped. People have stopped talking across the aisle. And there's a bunch of reasons why. You know, part of it is money. Part of it is that primaries have become so much more contentious and you don't want to be tarred and feathered as someone who talks to the other side. But the number one piece of advice that I think I would give, and this is what the lawmakers I talk to tell me is that they wish they could do, is if you have more conversations with people who disagree with you, you end up not only understanding the world better, but you end up being more influential, right? I'm guessing that for everyone in this room, you've got someone at work who like is who you wouldn't have a beer with, right? They're not necessarily someone who's your best friend. You don't necessarily look forward to the meeting that you're going to have where they're in the meeting. And yet, when you have that meeting, you make sure they're in the room because they're the ones who are bringing up the new ideas. They're the ones who are challenging how you see the world. They're the ones who are asking if the story inside your head is the story that works best. We understand at work how important it is to surround ourselves with people who might see things differently.
yeah,
But it turns out it's just as important in life,
yeah,
right? Like the best communities are the ones that don't all agree with each other. It's the ones where people disagree in interesting ways and they can hear each other.
that's good.
And so I'm hoping that, and politicians want it. I talk to politicians all the time.
Yeah.
They want this better world to emerge. And hopefully we're going to move towards that.
That's awesome.
Oh, I got an idea and a question. What we need to start seeing a conversational version of Crossfire, the old show on
Yes.
CNN. Instead
Yeah.
of the debate,
Yeah,
why not put them around a table and film them just having conversation?
Yeah.
You can't debate, but you just gotta like ask questions. A format would be you have to ask some questions to understand.
yes.
That would be fascinating.
Well, and as you say that, I actually think about the podcast that we mentioned before. Like if you think about the Joe Rogan show, Rogan talks to a lot of people that he doesn't agree with, right? But he never says, you're a moron, right? He asks these questions. And some of the people who come on his show say crazy things.
Oh yeah.
But he asks some questions. He does exactly what I think you're just describing. And I think that's why people like it. I think that's why people like your show, is because they know I'm going to tune in and I'm not going to hear two people just shouting at each other. I'm going to hear two people trying to understand each other.
Yeah.
That's what makes a show powerful.
Yeah.